kudos to you, Alex Moore, for telling me to hit that smash record button. Let's pray. God, give me grace to accept with serenity the things that cannot be changed, courage to change the things which should be changed, and wisdom to distinguish the one from the other, living one day at a time, enjoying one moment at a time, accepting hardship as a pathway to peace, taking, as Jesus did, this sinful world as it is, not as I would have it, trusting that you will make all things right if I surrender to your will, so that I may be reasonably happy in this life and supremely happy with you forever in the next. Amen. And so our commitments of presence.
Zoom update wasn't new to me, sorry. Be fully present. Set aside the usual distractions of things undone from yesterday, things to do tomorrow, and things impinging on the present through technology.
Listen generously. Listen intently to what is said. Listen to the feelings beneath the words. Listen to each other as you would listen to Scripture, attentively, mindfully, and open to the holy.
We come as equals. No person's gifts, limits, or experiences are more or less important than another's.
Is never share or die. You will be invited to share stories, but you will determine the extent to which you will want to participate.
No fixing. We are not here to change someone else's mind or to fix them.
Suspend judgment. By creating a space between judgments and reactions, we can listen to another person and to ourselves more fully.
Alex, if you'll do G.
Turn to wonder. If you find yourself becoming judgmental or cynical, try turning to wonder. I wonder what my reaction teaches me. I wonder what they are feeling right now.
Practice confidentiality, care. What is said here stays here, but what is learned here goes out. Welcome discomfort and dislocation. Move against an instinct to construct a mental place of safety or to check out. Love the questions themselves. Let your questions linger. Release the compulsion to answer them or to have them answered. I thank you for y'all's willingness to read through these each week, and I will continue using them. I started using them in the fall, and I will continue using them in classes that I lead, because part of what we want to accomplish as a community is to be able to honor each other as we are engaging in conversations that we might not always have agreement on, and that's okay. But I think these give us some parameters by which we can not only engage each other, but also love each other as a community. And I say that specifically wanting to commend you that, you know, we've made it through more than a month of this class. And I'm, as your pastor, I'm really grateful for the ways in which y'all have honored each other, both and letting others share, but also in the courage that each of you have demonstrated in sharing as well. And I find that to make our time together more rewarding and enriching for myself personally. And I hope that it has been that same way for you as well. So thank you for contributing to this program together. So what we wanted to, you know, there were a lot of, as I noted last week, for those of you who hadn't here last week, I overscheduled this class by 1 week because on the 27th, we'll be having our annual meeting, and therefore we won't be having this class. And so I wanted us to take a few highlighted chapters between 13 and 19 that I thought that might be of interest for us to discuss. And then next week, we'll finish up with just chapter 20, but then we'll also do kind of a review of the class as a whole. So what I thought was, and if there were any of these chapters between 13 and 19 that we're not going to talk about today that you really would like for us to cover, then we'll pick it up next week as well. But I specifically highlighted chapters 14, 15, and 19, minimum wage, debtor nation, and the right kind of candidate. So with that in mind, part of what we've been doing is having this conversation through the lens of these three questions. What is something that Campolo introduced that you found striking? According to Campolo, how should red letter Christians engage this issue? And then what are your thoughts on the matter and why? And so let's start with chapter 14. For any of you who would like to offer some thoughts or responses to that with regard to the minimum wage. Let's start with chapter 14. And we will just share as a group. So you won't need to raise your hand, just take turns and let's review.
I've got 2 cents to offer here.
Okay.
Yeah, right off the back, very first page, he says the minimum wage ought to be raised to $9 an hour. So it's kind of an anachronistic thing that
Absolutely.
the federal, I looked it up, the federal minimum wage on federal contract stuff is $15 an hour. So that's a minimum. And over the course of the labor shortage that's occurred with the pandemic, it's hard to find any big business that's paying less than $15 an hour, and many are paying more than that to bring workers in, which they're starved to do. But the same pressure applies to the small business owner, that that you've got so much revenue that you generate and you parse it out for supplies and labor, et cetera. And as the hourly wage goes up, you have to carve down the number of total employees you can find. The second thing that Campolo wrote was, is a quote off of, I'm reading off of Kindle, so I'm not sure what page it is, but it says, the most common comeback to my proposal was that raising the minimum wage would drive employers to move their companies and industries out of the country to places like India and China. Well, bingo, that's exactly what happened. And we're still seeing the impact of that and the attempt to try to bring that supply chain back, which is really lots of other problems are tied to this, not just the hourly wage and living wage of people that live in the United States.
Yeah, and thanks for reminding us that again. I mean, obviously, this book written in 2007, there's certainly a lot of statistics and facts and figures that are just supremely out of date. And again, owning that, acknowledging that there are points that that I think Campolo would argue still resonate, because there are certain arguments that are perennially made, like, well, if we, like you just said, Jack, if we raise this, then we're going to drive companies out, as in one of the comebacks. And so as I was reading today, I too, Jack, was thinking about each of these three chapters, but also through the lens of the last, the idea of a pandemic wasn't on his mindset in 2007. And, but the one thing that I did note here was he said that the minimum wage, when was it last, in the 90s? It was raised, I think, in the 90s to $7.25. And I don't remember, when it was that it became $7.25. But
2009.
2009 is when it became 725.
I think the state of Texas minimum wage is still 7.25.
It is.
Right.
It's
Well,
the lowest in the nation practically.
well, the federal minimum wage is 725. And so part of what he was talking about was inflation and the idea of the cost of living and cost of products, et cetera, being, that's even increasing it to 725, or that it would, that's what he said, is that although it will increase to 725 in the summer of 2009, it only addresses it in a minimum way, in a minimal way. But I would be curious to be thinking about, to ask Tony, like, okay, one of its concerns was inflation. Yes. Well, from 2009, we're talking about 13 years later, it hasn't changed. The federal minimum wage has not changed in 13 years. And what you could get for 725 in 2009 ain't anywhere what you can get for 725 today. And so we've seen, just as you said, Jack, there's been a big movement over the last 3 years to have a federal minimum wage of $15 an hour across the states, and maybe even rebranding it as the search for the living wage, what it would be a living wage, assuming, and I appreciate that, because a living wage in Austin, Texas is not the same living wage as Abilene, Texas, or Seattle, Washington, or Albany, New York. And so there is a variable that changes there. But and so the idea of a living wage, I'm not an economics expert, but I wonder if that isn't something that there isn't some sort of formula that helps us figure out what is that living wage according to where you're living geographically. It occurred to me, and I'm going to shut up, guys, and I'm so sorry, but it occurred to me in reading this chapter that housing affordability, affordable housing, I'm not sure that he really covers in this book. And as much as it has skyrocketed, especially like in Austin over the last 15 years, would be another topic, a hot topic, hot button item, which would need to be discussed and considered as how would red letter Christians approach the issue of affordable housing. As much as we know, as ridiculous as it is right now to live in the city of Austin, and that 13 years ago, when it became $7.25 an hour, you may have been, well, you certainly could have gotten into an apartment across the street from Anderson Mill Elementary School in 2009 at $7.25 an hour. You couldn't afford it today at $7.25 an hour. So those were some of my reflections in thinking about, wow, $7.25 just isn't anywhere close to a living wage. But thank you for sharing that, Jack, because I think that, I was thinking a lot of the same terms there. I don't have any insight about jobs going overseas. But I have wondered a lot about what we've heard about the two-sided coin of the workforce shortage. I've heard both, which is we're offering 17 an hour plus benefits and nobody's taking these jobs. And, I've got jobs open, the Great Recession, was it resignation the last year, and there's 1,000 variables for that, I'm sure, probably not all economic, but that's a lot of balls to juggle. That's a lot of plates to spin to try to better understand all this stuff, putting it together. Again, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to go off on such a tangent. Just Jack got me excited.
I do think just right after that, he does mention his counterpoint to basically enforce a mandate, I guess, where any country or any workers producing goods or services for international transactions, that they have a minimum wage as well, based on a living wage and wherever they live. Like China and India don't have as high of a cost of living in most places as most places in the US. But sort of to counteract that, where we know that one of the big environmental troubles right now is the idea of cheap clothing, and how there's an oversupply of cheap clothing, either in places like Walmart, Old Navy, or in thrift stores where they're overwhelmed with clothes that people have worn a few times and thrown out. And we know that the places like Malaysia have had, factory collapses where there's no real oversight for safety in these essentially sweatshops. And so the idea of enforcing a minimum wage mandate on those places, I mean, terribly difficult to try and enforce, but a step towards making the world, not just the US, but the world a more just place was the comeback. And I don't know how you get all the other countries on board with that or whatever. It would raise the prices of things in the US, but he points out that should we be paying for things where the poorest among us are subsidizing that?
Hillary, John, thanks for joining. I see you're at Covenant Presbyterian Church in San Antonio. Glad y'all could join us. We're talking about chapter 14 on the minimum wage, and just gathering some thoughts and feedbacks related to that. At a higher level, friends, what do you think Campolo says, maybe from a red letter Christian perspective? Why is this an important issue? Why is this a chapter from which he wanted to include a chapter in his book on the issue of minimum wage? What's more at the heart for why this is important?
From my perspective, when I was reading this, it's obviously a hot button political issue, so it fits naturally into his book. Economically, from my perspective, I think people that focus on the minimum wage are coming at the issue from the wrong side. Because if you raise a minimum wage, you're putting more money out there, and it's going to cause, just economically, it's going to cause the price of goods to raise, and so it's almost a zero-sum game. What I think, the way you ought to come at the issue of not minimum wage, but buying power, and I think he used that phrase in the chapter, buying power of poor individuals or lower wage people, is you address what they spend most of their income on, and you lower the cost of that, which is housing and healthcare. Housing and healthcare. And once you take, and he goes to Europe, for an example, and they also have great transportation. And like mass transit transportation. So you don't have to, if you were to do that in the US, which is probably not as feasible as tackling the other stuff, then you take out the majority of the inflated costs for folks. But affordable housing and affordable health care. And you don't have to worry about the minimum wage, because then you'll raise the buying power, the disposable income of lower wage people. That's my thoughts. But to your point, Josh, about why does he have this? It's a logical fit in his book. It's a hot button issue on both sides of the aisle.
But theologically, why?
I think he's got, pardon me, John, go ahead.
No, Jack, you go ahead.
Go ahead, Jack.
I think part of it is he's got a phrase in there about, isn't it time for red letter Christians to say out loud that we individually, consciously are making buying decisions, like at Walmart, which gets all their stuff from, it's why they've got less costly things for us to buy, but it's from China. It's sourced by low wage external sources. And so I think he's putting it back on the individual, saying, you need to think through what your choices are that may affect where the capability is of a business to pay a higher wage or make a competitive wage. So he's kind of put that back in our lap in that respect.
Yeah, I think that's certainly one part of it. And it's not just Walmart either, right? How much do we buy from Amazon.com? And there's another whole aspect of that as well. How about anybody else? What do you think, either theologically or biblically, what's at the chief heart of his concern as a red letter Christian as it comes to the minimum wage? What's chief at his heart here?
He does mention later in the chapter the idea of, is it market-driven wages or is it God-driven wages? And the idea that it's a hard idea to confront from a Christian perspective, I guess, our economy, the free market economy. And I know the finance guy, Dave Ramsey, had an interview a few months ago talking about he owns a large number of rental properties and was defending his decision to raise the rent in accordance with whatever the other people around him were charging, saying there's nothing wrong with charging the market rate. And some people felt like, well, that is your decision, but it's not the market's decision. It was your decision to raise that. So some people who have been living there were getting priced out of his properties because he's raising it to the market rate. And it is his right to do that, but it's not the market choosing to raise those rates. It's his decision. And it's the idea, what are you willing to pay for to buy justly or to spend justly? And it's I guess it's kind of like the idea of free will. We have free will, but what do we do with it? We have a free market, but what are we willing to do with it as Christians?
Okay. Rita.
I think part of it is that he's concerned with the class distinctions, and the gap is growing bigger and larger every year. And with that, we start to put people down for no other reason than their income level just doesn't sustain the same kind of lifestyle that we might have. And that the gap, it gets so that people don't want to associate with others when they should. And that happens within the circle of the church as well. Yeah. We have to be very careful. If you're wearing the latest clothes or got the highest fashion or, taking big vacations, you have to be careful of that because it makes the others in the congregation who can't do that feel less. And we shouldn't make our brothers and sisters in Christ feel less than who they are.
So I'm seeing little bits that are all here, and they're all these little bits are beginning to describe the thing at the middle. That, let me rephrase this. So maybe instead of saying, why do you think minimum wage is an important topic for Campolo? Let me ask this question. If Jesus were present in offering us a sermon today, why would the issue of minimum wage be important to Jesus? And we've heard little bits describing it, right? We've heard about an economic caste system, the gap being widened, right? And this idea of there's an emotional aspect of that for sure, of disparagement between those who have and those who don't. And like Alex, this idea of justice. There was just, doing justice and making decisions that are just, both individual, as an individual, and even with Jack, this idea of buying power and that. But why do you think the idea of a living wage or minimum wage would be important and central to Jesus?
I'm not sure it would be. I think he would preach on things he's already preached about. Matthew 25.
You don't
You
think
do these
you don't
for the
think
least
that
of us.
you don't think that he didn't preach about economics and
Oh,
about
yeah.
unjust economics and the
But he didn't.
economic oppression of those that were suffering under unfair taxes and undue burdens of those who had?
But that's not minimum wage related. I mean, is a minimum wage supposed to address disparity in wealth, or is it supposed to allow people to live with dignity for work that they've done? And if there's other ways, I think he would tell us to address allowing people, low-income people, to live in dignity. And it would involve the things like, and again, I go back to he cherry-picked Europe as an argument. You know, get rid of the highly inflated costs for that affect everybody, but disproportionately the poorer people. Educate cost of education that allows you to get better jobs with dignity. The cost of healthcare, which if you walk, take care of the sick, right? All the other things.
I'm needling on you guys on purpose because John, I want you to go to Jesus. And want you I want you to pull back to first century Jesus talking about, and here's what I think is the elephant, right? The thing that we're describing from all angles. I think the thing that we are talking about are what are these systems in place that keep the poor, right? What are the systems in place that, and I get the idea of dignity, but I think you can be incredibly rich and still have no dignity, so I get the idea of that, but I think that the idea, and it's one of the tenets that we're striving for as a missional goal, which is to eradicate systemic poverty. And when we have systems that make it difficult or when we have systems that help, that sustain persons in a life of poverty, then the systems themselves are the ones that need to be addressed, that need to be tackled and taken on. And that is specifically systems that Jesus spoke about, that I think the systems of poverty is something that very specifically that Jesus attended to throughout the Gospels, and is something which I believe, so maybe it's not the United States version of minimum wage as a textbook descriptor of what Jesus would be speaking to. I think he would be having us pull back out to the larger issue of, and I appreciate some of what y'all have said is the choices that we get to make. What are some of those choices that I as an individual get to make? Well, we have that same power to make those decisions on that larger level by answering the question, what sort of society do we want to live in? And we get to have agency in how we structure that society in which we live in. We do not lack power to comment on the kind of society that we would like to live in that is aligned with those issues that were important to Jesus. Alex, I saw you raise your hand, buddy.
So I guess I could see a case where Jesus might say, if we're truly a society that lives as Jesus would have us live, we shouldn't need a minimum wage established by the get. We shouldn't need a systemic minimum wage because people would do what was right and take care of their employees. We've proven over and over again that's not the case. We currently need it, and the minimum wage current as it is, it certainly gives cover to some employers saying we're doing what we can legally. And when you talk about wage theft, people who hire people for one rate but then pay them the minimum wage, if that, and there's separate minimum wage for waiters and waitresses who get a minimum wage with tips, but if they're not serving people, then they have to do other things, but they're not getting paid higher to clean out the fridge or stuff like that. So yeah, I think we shouldn't need a minimum wage if we were truly living as Christ would have us live. But
Yeah, I think you're right. And again, now we're not Christ, but I can certainly acknowledge that we live with sin. And as those who live with sin, we're tending, I think Dave Ramsey, is the example you brought up is, yeah, he's in a fair market, capitalistic world. He absolutely has the right. And I actually wouldn't condemn him for that, because you go into business to make money. And he doesn't hide from that. And what Dave would tell you, Dave Ramsey, is if I have a benefactor, if I have charitable things for which I feel Christ is calling me to do, then I do them through my charitable means. But if I own 30 rent houses for the purposes of raising money so that I can give more, then I'm going to do what I do. Now, that being said, anybody see here in Austin, the house that's for sale, like 1601 Westover? It's like at 24th and Mopac. It's an 1,800 square foot home. This is no joke. It is a one-story, 1,800 square feet. It's on the market today and could be yours for the low, low price of $2.4 million. That is ridiculous. And there is something within our society that has allowed for something like that to take root. And so how would we address issues such that? And Rita, I think I saw you move to say something. No? Okay. Kurt?
I think there is something, and it's called socialism here in this country, where in other countries, there's no question that you have health care paid by the government, but paid by taxes for all of the things that are considered basic. And we get the theme socialism in reaction to that kind of a request, that people should have food and clothing and housing as a basic minimum. And it's a difficult thing. It's just not something that this country has developed.
Well, you're right, Kurt. And I honestly don't know how I feel about the matter. And I wrestle with it as a Christian, as you know, in part because we have built a nation that is free market and strives for that, and capitalistic. And I don't have any qualms with that. At the same time, though, on the balance of that is Reformed theologian John Calvin. Part of his support, he was pro-government, and part of his support of the government was there are things that we need the government to do for social welfare and for peacekeeping of the community in which we live. And so with regard to how we structure ourselves as a nation in a free market nation, what are those systems in place that help us to ensure for the social welfare of those who cannot participate, who don't have the means to be able to elevate? And there are the minimalistic things like Medicaid, Medicare, the idea that we're all chipping into the pool of Social Security so that we can, when we get into those infirm years of age, that those sunset years of life, that we can ensure that we would have access to services that provide us human dignity and health, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we all agree to participate in that so that our society is not one that is overrun or overburdened with all of these other concerns. And yet it's not really working. I like what Rita said, it's not really working. There's things that are growing further and further apart. And having been on the phone with someone just this week whose mother is in desperate need of full-time assisted living and has no financial means to provide full-time assisted living and can't cover it at home, they're in a real pickle. They can't afford $7,000 a month. And so what will our society do to help ensure the dignity, life, and healthcare of this woman who needs care that is well exceeds that which they can provide at home? And, how do we want, as Christians, hope to attend to the systems in which we live and submit to ensure that those sort of things are covered?
It looks like fun.
I see John wanting to argue. Go for it.
Not argue. I go back to, the bow tie model, that we've talked about with homelessness and other issues, where by the time you hit that knot, that's the tipping point. And the person who is having to pay $7,000 a month for assisted living in their house is so far over on the right side of that bow tie that, you have to radically restructure something so that you get them back over onto the left-hand side where they have available health. And you don't do that by raising the benefits of Medicare. You could quadruple the minimum wage. It's not going to solve that problem. That's where the government needs to come in and control that $7,000 price tag. So it never gets there.
Yeah.
And as far as this person that you were talking to, if you want to talk separately, I might be able to help out later.
Oh, good. Did you hear that? Hillary said she's going to open her checkbook and fund $8,000 a month for healthcare because there's $1,000 kick up to me. Just put that up there. I think did anybody else want to say something on this before we go to the next topic? Because I think there might be some overlap. Rita?
I just have one question, and it's kind of something that people will put out there because the scripture says we will always have the poor.
Yes. Yes.
So there are limits to what we can do, and we can work our fingers to the bone, but they'll never be enough to really satisfy taking care of all the poor. We just can't do it, but we have to find ways to do the best that we can do.
I think I agree. And the pastor who preached at my ordination in 2009, that was the passage that he preached on. And I wasn't very familiar with it at the time. I'd never really done an in-depth study on it. And it has been something that has gnawed on me for almost 13 years now of the poor will be with you always. And part of that I take away, which is, Jesus is saying that to his disciples, which is to attend to me while I am still with you. And for us as disciples to not forget to tend to our spiritual selves and our spiritual relationship with Jesus instead of fully depleting ourselves in service to the poor. Because I've seen that too. I've seen people just rapidly burn themselves out and not tend to their spiritual wells, the relationship with Jesus. All you have to do is just look at public school educators and you will see the burnout, the depletion of their spiritual well in service to the poor by not tending to Jesus. However, I think I balance that with this Matthew 25 idea, Rita, and that the idea is, the kingdom of God is one where we are striving to eliminate all those things. And so work like the devil, rest like Jesus. Work, I just made that up. Please, I hope that wasn't bad. But I think you're right. I mean, which is, while we should be working our bums off because we believe that maybe, we'll make a dent in that in our lifetime, while at the same time realizing that it isn't something that will be completely achieved until Jesus returns. And And I love that passage. I mean, I've wrestled with it. It has stirred me greatly. And I have heard it abused as well, right? From the apathetic point of view. Well, the poor will be with you always. What are you going to do? You know, you can't bring everybody up. And, you know, maybe, you know, I don't know, maybe there's truth, maybe,
Well,
but we can
Josh,
certainly try hard.
I always
John?
thought that passage was, like you said, abused, cherry picked again, like the Second Amendment, in order to have a well-trained and regulated militia, the right of the people to bear arms.
Yeah.
So when Jesus says there'll be poor always, I thought that was a very specific point in time where there will be poor always. I'm only going to be here for a little bit of time. So listen to what I'm doing. You know, don't worry about the poor right outside, you know, the cave where we're staying or whatever. But I'm here right now. Focus on me. Listen to me.
Yeah. And biblically, that may be exactly what he's talking about. But as someone who doesn't live contemporary with Jesus, what does that passage speak to me? Well, that's how it speaks to me. So let's go into chapter 15, the idea of debtor nation, because the idea of economics, I think there's some, at least what triggered with me and moving into that is both some of this idea of, and he didn't hit this as heavy as I think Dave Ramsey would have hit it, Alex, which is not only federal debt, the debt by which we owe as a nation, but also consumerism debt, unsecured debt of individuals. And I think both of those, I wish he could have covered more about, especially the consumer debt and the disease of consumer debt. But what are some takeaways here? Now that we're thinking this idea of, you know, why is this important? Why is this chapter worthy? Why is it the debt of our nation? Why is that, as a Christian, why is that something that should be included as a chapter in his book, from your perspective?
This is Diane. I know recently I read somewhere that a large cause of our current inflation is the fact that the government put out so much stimulus money during the pandemic, and that the debt of our country, and so that it's not this increase in the cost of the goods, but is the decrease in the value of our dollar to buy things. And I thought that was an interesting concept and different, certainly a different way to look at what's going on currently.
Yeah. If you have access to that, I'd love for you to send that to me, Diane. Diane, I'd love to read that.
It was an email I found somewhere. Now trying to find it could be challenging.
If you come across it, I'd love to see it.
Yeah. So I think it does make us realize that, you know, the current debt of the nation is definitely an issue with long-term effect, just like if you go into excessive debt personally or as a family.
Good, thank you.
You know, the debt, like if you're an
You're breaking up.
debt is a family, you're paying a great amount of money in interest, a great amount of interest that could be used on something else.
Okay, Diane, thank you. We got 2/3 of that, and but thank you. I think we got the point of that. Thank you.
I'm sorry.
It's okay. Don't apologize. Not your fault. It's technology. We live with what we got. How about Alex?
Josh, do you know what our current interest payment is on the repayment for the church each month?
Do you?
I could pull it up. I know it's more than you would like it to be, and I think that's the idea, is when everyone from individuals to states to the nation is paying so much money in interest every month and every year, what could be done with that money is the potential for that money is a lot of wasted good that could have been done instead.
Heck yeah, baby. You open the door, I'm gonna walk through it, man. Dude, yes, that is one of the theological reasons why I drove so hard for us to get this debt under control and to get it knocked out. I can't pull it up right now, but hopefully at the annual meeting, we'll be able to share that number with you, how much interest money we have saved by paying this off early. And I believe right now we're around $500,000 of interest saved by paying this thing off early. Now, that doesn't equate to just immediate cash in hand, but that was going to be cash coming out of this place to paying the bank, right? And I don't have a problem with banks. I really don't. You know, we all have to interface with banks. We all need banks. Banks are a for-profit business. But I think you're right? There's opportunity costs of how much opportunity we may lose at the expense of how much we spend on interest, especially from a nonprofit point of view. And that holds not only for the church and its own debt, but it holds for the government. And, you know, John struck a pain in my heart earlier when he said that the intercontinental transportation might not be something we could tackle as easily as healthcare. But yeah, if we weren't paying out the nose, maybe we could. But also it's the same thing for individual, the interest, the credit card interest, the interest that persons pay individually, and the opportunities lost related to owing money to an institution that's for profit.
So sorry, I put pain in your heart, Josh. No, my comments about that were there's not a demand for it in this country, nor is it quite as feasible for the purpose it is in Europe, mainly moving people. Except, you know, maybe Ron and Ann Shire would like a better rail network because they ride everyone the rail. But, you know, anyway, I for the debtor nation, I mean, I think there's that's a little bit of, you know, the wrong side of the right coin, because macroeconomics are not microeconomics. Greek debt is not the same as U.S. national debt. You know, we follow monetary policy that allows our country to print more money rather than fiscal policy that treats the budget as a zero-sum game, even though we have laws that he highlighted in there that were put in place to try and make that so. So I on some of these, I can't get past the economics.
Yeah,
I mean,
and that's where, again, and I see it, and I see that struggle in you, John, because and as a math nerdy kind of person myself, you know, I struggle with it too. But I think that what I think Jesus would challenge you and me is to get past the economics. Right. What are all the spiritual damages related to the one who is living in debt, economic debt? What are the spiritual damages that one suffers related to being in economic debt? What are the spiritual damages to our nation as one who is beholden to economic entanglement or indebtedness to another nation?
Again, I'm not sure he'd preach as much about being in debt or not. I think he would preach about why are you going into debt? What are you spending your money on? And I think he'd argue that we're spending it all in the wrong places. When you look at the budgets that we pass and the amount of money that we dumped into, you know, a place like Afghanistan, you know, and got literally nothing out of there, you know.
Right.
Oh, we got something out of there. We got thousands and hundreds of thousands of dead lives. I mean, on both sides of that.
I'd say we left that there. We didn't get it out. But But that's my point is, I don't think Jesus would come back and preach on, macroeconomics and, and the amount of good debt versus bad debt. I think he said, what are you spending your money on in the first place, and why are you running out of it?
I think,
are you running out of it for the right reasons?
Yeah,
I think it goes back to, if you look at debt, it's an obligation, right? And you've rented money. It's what debt is, as opposed to buying something outright which you own. You've taken somebody else's money to do a project, whether it's build something, or whether it's building a road, whether it's building your house, whether it's financing the capability to send troops into Afghanistan. You need the cash now, and somebody rented you the money to do that for so much thing. The national obligation there is who's renting you the money, and what obligation do you have to them? Which, in the case of one of the things he points out, is how much control China has over the choices and decisions we make as Americans, because of what the amount of debt that we owe them, or the amount of if we printed the money ourselves, how much we have decreased the value of our own currency, to where China is now looking at maybe they can put in place a currency that is the national or the worldwide standard, as opposed to the US dollar. And there's a tipping point at some point that brings to the decision as to where those obligations are, and who you're obliged to let's call the shots.
Jack, I hear that, and I noticed in this book that was written like in 2006 or something like that, where he talks about, there's a line in there that says, are we going to be executing China's foreign policy because of the debt? And 15 years later, that's absolutely, obviously not the point. The Europeans have been trying to replace the dollar as the world, reserve currency with the euro. That's never going to happen. The rest of the world wouldn't allow the yen to be any kind of debt, or not the yen, I'm sorry, whatever the Chinese
yuan.
Yeah, the yuan. And some people would argue that we have more control over China because of the debt that we owe them than they have over us because of what we owe them. I mean, if China right now came and tried to cash in, what do you think we'd say? Pound sand. Partly because we couldn't pay it back. The U.S. government that's why you can't look at and say run your finances the same way the government does, and vice versa. We have no intent of paying back the national debt, partly because we can't.
So let me pause there, and because there's and Alex, hold that thought, because John, you're elevating two problems, right? I mean, you're elevating integrity as a problem, right? And I don't want to be a part of that. If that, and you may be right. You're now talking at a higher level than me economically, but my faith tells me I don't want to be a part of that. If I'm going to rent money, then I'm going to honor that which for whom I owe, right? Now, that's one thing, and I get that both as an individual, and I know it's obviously different at that larger level. But the other part that I think I have issues, and I pulled this up because this, Jesus may not have very explicitly said, anything with regard to, the United States national debt. But Jesus is not only a rabbi, master, but is a scholar of Jewish literature, from which Proverbs would come out of, from which Exodus and Leviticus and Deuteronomy, where the law is laid out, and knowing the history of the movement of people and the entanglements that they have, and this, that, and the other. I think that this would be something that that would be formative, not only formative to Jesus, but something that he would also uphold. The rich rule over the poor and the borrower slave to the lender. And this idea that when I owe Jack Lloyd $100 and I can't pay Jack Lloyd $100, there is now beef between us. There is a spiritual entanglement between us. Jack could be the kind of person who says, I've got Josh right where I want him. And now I'm going to get out of Josh what I want to get my $100, or I've got him and I've got him pinned to where I need. And at the same time, I am spiritually feeling maybe unworthy, ashamed, embarrassed, because I borrowed this money and I can't honor that which I told Jack I would pay him back on. And now I feel beholden to Jack. I mean, this is the feudal system. To some large, it's in, you know, the feudal system, indentured servitude, whatever, however you want to define it, right? Now I owe something, sharecropping. You know, there is this relationship that is now not something where we are addressing each other spiritually on that same level of humanity. And I have something beholden over you.
That's one game, but we're talking about at a national level, it's a completely different game. Think about the PPP loan. You remember when Session a year and a half ago discussed the first PPP loan and applying for it or not?
Right.
I spoke up and I said I was initially not in favor of it because we were talking about it not as a loan. We were talking about it as taking a loan that we had no intention of paying back, right? And so I was against that. And then, you know, understand that the rules of that game was it was essentially not a loan. It might have been called a loan and you had to apply for loan forgiveness. But the lender and the borrower knew the rules of the game. There was no intent to pay that money back. The borrower knew it, the lender knew it. That's not what this Proverbs is about. That's not what you think the Chinese think we're ever going to pay back the money we borrow from them. It's a transaction that serves both nations for their own purposes.
I was looking at this a lot differently. I think it was Martin Luther King was talking about, I think, the Vietnam War, and he was starting to realize that it was something that he couldn't support, and he wanted people not to support it. And I think there was a lot of reasons, because the money that was being spent was a lot of Black people going to Vietnam and dying. So what we were facing was people were being killed by our expenditures. And that's something that I think he was beginning to fight before he died. So I think when you talk about debtor nations, what are we spending our money on? Are there things in here like we have supported war? And every time we do it, it becomes a reality where we see people injured and killed and come back and live in this country, different people. And I think maybe that's what Jesus would be saying. Look at what you're doing to your population. Look at the people that end up killing themselves because of the war and what they did. So that's what I was thinking is where's the moral decision about what our country spends its money on? Anyway, that's my perspective on this.
Thank you, Kurt. And I think both that would be Campolo's concern here. I think that does elevate that. Alex, and I'm sorry, I didn't come back to you earlier.
All right. I think connecting it to Pastor John's sermon today, when he mentioned the girl he was talking to who had been kicked out of her house, and you know, everything was a threat. When you're in debt, everything is a threat. If it's your kid has a cough, that's a threat. If your car takes an extra second to start, assuming you have a car, that's a threat. If it gets really cold and you have to turn up the heat a little bit more, that's a threat to your existence. And it's hard to sleep at night knowing that you may not be able to pay rent the next month, or if you've got to hit 2 food pantries this week, or if you may actually have to go see a doctor, or God forbid, an emergency room where you never know what the cost is going to be. And that's the, if I don't know if Jesus would advocate for a full-blown socialism, but certainly the idea of the basic safety net. I know John Seaman earlier was advocating for universal basic income, is what it sounded like to me. Something where people can have a minimum, that the safety net, where they know if something happens, if their kid has to get an x-ray, it's not going to kick them out of their apartment. If they lose their job one week, they're not going to miss an apartment. They're not going to miss a rent payment. We have families in transition, or what they call students who don't have a solid home environment necessarily in school. And a family in transition, they can't live securely. They can't live peacefully because of how our society is structured, where all of these things are the burden of all these rests on the individual. Like y'all mentioned, there's not a reliable, easy transportation network or healthcare system, or necessarily fair income opportunity. So I think that's it's the structural idea of how our society operates that makes it disproportionately harder on those who have less.
Kind of to go off of what Kurt was saying, I just have some disparate thoughts about the government spending money on war and things. And one thing that it comes back to from the first page is he talks about the government not even having money to fund Social Security, because every few years that comes up that, oh, we're going to have to privatize because we don't have enough money, and everybody gets in a panic, and then somehow it dies down. And in hooking on with that is also Medicaid, how doctors don't want to take new Medicaid, Medicare patients because they don't get enough money back. So that's another way, looking at how you spend your money or borrow your money and use what you have. I mean, I'm enjoying all this conversation. I am not an economist. I never took economics in school. I would probably flunk it. My mind does not work that way. So I'm enjoying hearing what people that are a lot more knowledgeable than me are talking about. But another thing came to mind, that how Jesus would think about this. Wasn't in the Bible, he was 12 when he went to the temple and he knocked over all the tables of the money lenders. And that's the lenders, probably because they were charging too much in interest rates, but still, like, that should not be done, so.
Yeah, he wasn't 12. I mean, that was during the run up to, that was the week before he died. And
I thought it was, they talked about that he had done that when he was growing up. There was a gap, and then they showed.
No, he was in the temple teaching, and he had gotten lost.
Okay.
And so the parents were like, "Where are you?" And he's like, "I was in my father's house. Where else would you have expected me to be?" But yes, he comes in. It's okay. No, he comes into Jerusalem. No, your point still holds, age regardless. Your point still holds. He arrives into Jerusalem, and he is just incensed and outraged that, yes, there is unfair financial practices that are taking advantage of the poor, and it's happening in the temple of God. And so he's doubly incensed in that regard. I'm noting the time, but I want to make sure we've heard from mostly everybody. Rita, did you want to add anything to this?
The only thing I thought about all this discussion, I think it was the period of the 90s when banks were lending like crazy and people were buying homes that they could not
Rita, I'm
afford.
sorry to interrupt. That there is Pastor Dan Milford of Covenant Presbyterian Church. And he is my good buddy. Rick Covington and I worked on the Overture for Mental Health, and has been a good partner. And Hillary lives in San Antonio. And so when she asked, are there some churches here? I said, if I lived in San Antonio, that's the man I would want to listen to every Sunday. And so thank you, Dan. I'm good to see you, and glad you're here. We're talking about Jesus.
I'm glad to hear that.
It's a good thing for a church group.
Vaya con Dios. All right, Rita, I apologize.
Okay, what I was going to say during all these discussions, I was thinking about giving loans to people for exorbitant price homes that they could not afford to sustain.
Yes.
And then when the tables turned, they were walking away from them. They just left them empty because they couldn't pay for them. And they ended up being in the bank's coffers. And I think that is such an unchristian thing to have done. And they knew in their hearts when they were doing it, it was wrong. At least I feel they did. I don't know how they could have not known.
Well, I was one of those. Wendy and I did that. We were one of those who got one of those predatory loans or housing loans. And it was
Subprime.
Yeah,
They're called subprime.
Subprime, right? And it was only 16 months before my world fell apart, and I suffered all of the depression that came along with it. I was fortunate that we were able to not only sell it, but sell it at cost. And I think we made $500 on the deal. And we got really lucky in that. And I acknowledge that. That was this May of 2005. We got really lucky. But yeah, you're right. There's something that was immoral, something nefarious, right? We knew we should not have given a loan to these young people who we knew weren't going to be able to afford it. Yeah, I think you're right. So that's that control of sin that it infiltrates everything. Sin infiltrates systems as much as our bodies, and that's where our structures, where we have agencies in our society to offer regulations to help mitigate the impact of sin. Same thing when we have, what's that called? Rent control, like in New York. It's the same sort of thing there, where, we have agencies that are seeking to sustain or to mitigate the rampant effects of sin and immorality. I note the time, and I'm going to pause here, and I'm going to include this last chapter into next week, because I think that 19 and 20 are really bringing home the overarching ideas of Campolo's point, both in candidates that we want to support and or back, and then how we pull it all together, maybe even on that larger meta level of the society in which we choose to live in. I will say a few things I'd like for us to do. One thing I'd like for us to do before we close our time together today is let's reflect over the past hour and take just a moment of what was the experience of this conversation like for you?
I think it was wonderful. I am just so happy to hear different people talking about things they won't talk about other places. And it's just, I am so pleased to hear these different observations that I think are important. They are important. So I think it was wonderful.
Good. Thank you, Kurt.
I think the conversation was more engaging than the reading. I could have taken a nice long nap with some of those chapters, trust me.
I thought it was very educational. I learned things. Like I said, I'm not an economist. I don't know a lot about, an economics class. So very good hearing everyone's opinions on things and being able to talk about it and listen and learn is wonderful.
I'm going to come in and support what Rita said. I thought the discussion was a lot better than the book. For me personally, the first half of this course, meaning the first half of the book, much stronger than the back half in terms of the writing and the arguments in the book. But I thought our discussion rose above it, and I like that. Also, one of my favorite economists is the guy that wrote The Tipping Point. And in a couple of other books there, he had a great one on David versus Goliath, as a matter of fact. He used to write articles for the Atlantic, I think. I can't remember what his name is. It's
Malcolm Gladwell.
Yeah, Gladwell. I would love to see what Gladwell would say about, if Jesus came back and preached on the national debt, or some of these other ones that we, federal budget, minimum wage, stuff like that. Because I think he would come at it a lot more like Jesus would do it, because he wouldn't just look at, the wave top issue of how much debt is the U.S. in, or how low is the minimum wage. He'd look at, the real issue, which is buying power of individuals, and how is a nation, regardless of where it's getting its money, whether it's printing it or taking it away from some other program, where should a nation spend its money to do the most good by its people?
Yeah, thank you. I will simply just say, and then I'm going to ask someone to close using one of those 4 prayers there in the handout. I will simply say, I am grateful to you. I feel very safe in visiting with y'all, and I have very much enjoyed all of our conversations, but today I really appreciate the way in which we were able to discuss, and I apologize if I overspoke, and I appreciated being humbled by John Seaman. I'm not saying that I agree with John, I'm just saying that I've been humbled, and I'm going to have to do some deeper reflection on him calling me out. But I love that, and especially this makes me just love to be a part of a congregation where we can grow together and have these conversations and growing together, and still love each other, and it means the world to me. So I thank you for the spirit of which y'all have approached the table, and that y'all stay at the table. So thank you for that. Would someone be willing to read one of those 4 prayers to close our time? Thank you, Rita. Let's get you unmuted.
Oh God, show us clearly the heart of your kingdom. We do not protect, even if our life is destined to lead us to the cross, or if the way leads us to losing our lives. We will march in the face of distress and contrary winds. Teach us how to dispense with unnecessary things. Let us go forward without fear of death in order to fulfill our mission simply, surely, and steadily. Reveal to us our station clearly, and strengthen us to teach and guide by our example all persons, even those who are ruled by evil. We pray that you may find us worthy to work through us. Amen.